Thank you, Dottie. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jared Deutsch. I'm the Executive Director at Georgia Audubon. We appreciate you coming tonight and certainly appreciate your support for our Georgia Grows Native for Birds Month events. Our rescheduled Georgia Bird Fest events kick off this weekend, and we want to thank all of our event sponsors and patrons for their support this year. And you, I'm sure, saw their names listed on the opening slides. And I wanted to give you a few updates on upcoming events that you all may be interested in participating in. Next Wednesday, September 23rd, we have our virtual Swift Night Out. And fast forwarding to October 8th and 11th, we'll be holding an avian advocate volunteer training for people interested in becoming volunteer certifiers with our wildlife sanctuary program. Hopefully you were able to participate in our sanctuary tour this past Sunday. We have a sip and draw event with bird author and illustrator David Sibley on October 14th. And of course, you'll find a full listing and registration information for these and other events and on our digital resources page of our website. And we'll be posting a link to that page in the chat box. And finally, of course, if you're not a member of Georgia Audubon, we always encourage you to join us in our efforts to build places where birds and people thrive throughout Georgia. As a statewide organization, we're always welcome to add more people to the mix and to our flock. And as Dottie said, she's going to be here to help guide us through the process. Please ask questions in the chat box or the question and answer box, and we'll be holding questions until Mr. Tallamy finishes his presentation. And so without further ado, I would like to welcome you all to Doug Tallamy's talk tonight. And Doug is a professor in the Department of Entomology and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Delaware, where he has authored 103 research publications and has taught insect-related courses for 40 years. Chief among his research goals is to better understand the many ways insects interact with plants and how such interactions determine the diversity of animal communities. His book, Bringing Nature Home, How Native Plants Sustain Wildlife in Our Gardens, was published by Timber Press in 2007 and was awarded the 2008 Silver Medal by the Garden Writers Association. The Living Landscape, co-authored with Rick Dark, was published in 2014. Doug's new book, Nature's Best Hope, released by Timber Press in February of 2020 this year, is a New York Times bestseller. Among his awards are the Garden Club of America, Margaret Douglas Medal for Conservation, Tom Dodd Jr. Award for Excellence, the 2018 AHSBY Morrison Communication Award, and the 2019 Cynthia Westcott Scientific Writing Award. Without further ado, turn it over to you, Doug.
Thank you. And thanks for everybody coming tonight. There we go. All right, what I want to do tonight is talk about my idea of what nature's best hope is. But before I do that, I want to revisit what happened last fall. Pretty sure it happened in Georgia, but it certainly happened up here in southeast Pennsylvania. I think it was from Massachusetts down to Georgia, then all the way to the Mississippi. All the red oaks got together and decided they would make their acorns at the same time. That is called an oak mast. And if you're easily entertained like I am, maybe you took one of those acorns and just watched it. And if you were lucky, maybe you saw this happening. It looked like a little blemish on the side there, and it was pretty obvious that an insect was gnawing its way out of the acorn. And sure enough, here comes an insect larva squeezing out, kind of looks like the Pillsbury Doughboy. Finally, through that little hole, plops down on the ground. Very dangerous time for this larva because it is good to eat, full of protein, full of fat, and everything wants to eat it. So it's got to protect itself by more wiggling. It wiggles itself right below the surface of the ground in about, I don't know, about 30 seconds, gets right down there. Once underground, it stretches in all different directions and makes a little chamber and then transforms itself into a pupa. And then it stays underground for 2 years. after which it comes out as an acorn weevil. Now, a lot of people think that weevils have big noses. It certainly looks like they do, but that's actually an extension of the head capsule, and the mouth parts are way down here. And they use those mouth parts to chew a hole down into the center of the acorn. Then they turn around and lay an egg in that hole, and the egg hatches in the larva. That's how the larva gets down to the center of the acorn, where it can develop in safety. And you might wonder why it spends 2 years underground. Well, red oak acorns take 18 months to mature. And if it came out the very next year, there'd be a much smaller crop for it. Well, after the acorn weevil leaves, it leaves a hole. And you know that nature abhors a vacuum, even in an acorn. So there actually are specialized ants in the genus Temnothorax, 3 species of ants that live inside the vacated holes made by acorn weevils inside of acorns. And if they discover a brand new hole, they get very excited. Everybody gets together and they move the entire colony from their dilapidated acorn, carry the eggs, carry the queen even. And after they're all in there, it only takes about 30 minutes. They set up a guard at the entrance and make sure nobody else comes in. Now, about this time, my wife, when she first heard this talk, said, what is your point? What are you trying to tell us? My point is very simple. That's a specialized interaction that occurs in my yard. This is another one, the very mutualistic interaction between blue jays and acorns. Blue jays are the major dispersers of acorns. But it's just a few of millions of specialized interactions that comprise most of nature. So for example, if you want pileated woodpeckers breeding in your yard, you have to have lots of carpenter ants because that's what they rear their young on. Here's a parent mouth full of carpenter ants going to feed its baby here. And you're not going to have carpenter ants unless you have the big trees to make the carpenter ants. You won't have this bee, Andrena facilii, unless you have this plant, Facilia, because that is the only pollen that species of bee can rear its young on. As a matter of fact, you won't have 13 species of native bees unless you have the pollen of various species of sunflowers, Helianthus, because that is the only genus of pollen that they can rear their young on. You're not going to have Baltimore checker spots unless you have white turtlehead. Again, nature's full of these specialized relationships. But today, these relationships, nature itself is on the ropes. And it's on the ropes because we did not listen to Teddy Roosevelt's advice. Way back in 1908, the state of Arizona was going to mine the Grand Canyon. And Teddy was president. He heard about this. He went to the canyon. He looked out over the edge. And he said, leave it as it is. And with those 5 words, he started the process of creating the Grand Canyon National Park. Well, the problem today, of course, is that we can no longer leave most of the country as it was because we have already changed it. Not so much for the better. There's only about 5% of the lower 48 states that's anything close to its original pristine ecological state. And that's because we've logged the country often repeatedly. We have tilled it, we have drained it, we've grazed it. We've got 770 million acres of rangeland in this country. We've paved it or otherwise developed it. We've straightened our rivers and dammed them, and you can spell that any way you want. We have polluted our skies and changed our climate for centuries to come. We've drained our aquifers. We've introduced more than 3,300 species of plants from other continents, many of which are what we call invasive species. They're changing the composition of native plant communities almost everywhere. In short, we have carved up nature into tiny remnants of its former self, each one of which is too small and too isolated from each other to be able to maintain or sustain the species that run the ecosystems that actually support us. You might wonder why we've done all those things. Well, we had this idea that the earth, our nest, was so big that we could foul it forever and there wouldn't be any consequences. But of course, we were wrong about that. And that's why we're getting headlines like this. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Talking about global insect decline. And you Audubon people know about this one. And North America's lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. As a matter of fact, the UN predicts that we're going to lose 1 million species to extinction in the next 20 years. And they report this as if it's just news. But let me tell you, this is not an option, folks. It's like saying we're going to lose oxygen in the next 20 years. No, it's really not an option. We have to make sure this doesn't happen. Well, I could go on about the pox that we humans have delivered upon the environment, this upon all of our houses. But that's not what this talk is about. This talk is about a cure for that pox. And it's a cure that'll take small efforts from a lot of people, but they will deliver enormous physical, psychological, and environmental benefits to everybody. Let's return briefly to this headline. The insect apocalypse is here. What does it mean for the rest of life on Earth? Well, E.O. Wilson, the great Edward O. Wilson, Harvard emeritus, greatest entomologist alive today, one of the best biologists of all times. He told us what it meant way back in 1987 in this paper called The Little Things That Run the World. What would happen if we lost insects? And what he said was, life as we know it depends entirely on insects. So if they were to disappear, all these very nasty things would happen. The first thing would happen is that most of the flowering plants would also disappear because insects are the major pollinators of those plants. And if the flowering plants disappeared, the energy flow through terrestrial habitats would change dramatically, and it would cause the collapse of the food webs that support our animals, our amphibians, our reptiles, our birds, our mammals, to a lesser extent, our freshwater fish. They would all disappear. The biosphere, the living portion of the earth, would rot because we'd lose insect decomposers that today rapidly turn over nutrients, and all we would have would be bacteria and fungi. And of course, humans would not survive any of those drastic changes. The good news is that we can save our insects. We can save our birds. We can save nature itself. But to do that, we're going to have to change the way we landscape. Why is that? Well, humans are products of nature. You'd think this would be obvious, but a lot of people need to be reminded. We are products of nature. We totally depend on healthy natural ecosystems that produce what we call ecosystem services. And those things keep us alive. Here's what plants give us, just a few of the things. They produce oxygen, pretty important, clean our water and slow its journey to the salty sea where we can't use it anymore. Here's a big one, capturing carbon, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, locking it up in their tissues, and even more important, pumping it into the ground. Our soils are brown or black because of the carbon that plant roots have deposited in the soils, where it stays essentially and forever. Our plants build topsoil, hold it in place. If we didn't have any plants, there'd be no soil on the planet. It would all be washed into the ocean. They prevent floods, they dampen severe weather, they do all these important things. What do animals do for plants? They provide pest control services. They pollinate about 90% of our flowering plants, disperse the seeds of those plants, and many other things. So designing landscapes that destroy the production of these ecosystem services really is not an option. We've been doing it a long time, and it's never been a good option, but it's a terrible option today because we've got 7.8 billion people on the planet, which is more than the planet can handle. Now, there have been visionaries through the ages that have recognized that we do not have a healthy relationship with planet Earth, and one of the most vocal in the early 1900s was Aldo Leopold. He's considered the father of modern conservation. Wrote lots of wonderful things. One of the things he said was the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. And other than a few indigenous peoples around the world, we have been terrible at living on a piece of land without spoiling it. Particularly the Western cultures, our extractive cultures, where we just want to wring as much as we can out of the planet, as if we could go someplace else once we've wringed out the last drop. So Aldo said that we really need to develop what he called a land ethic. He read about this in the Sand County Almanac. He said he recognized we needed to use the earth. We needed to farm it and lumber it and graze it, and mine and hunt. But we needed to learn to do that without destroying local ecosystems. And he called that our land ethic. That was his dream, that we would develop the land ethic. One thing that has always puzzled me is Aldo never talked about developing a land ethic where we actually lived. And I'm not sure why that was, but I suspect that the notion that humans and nature cannot coexist in the same place at the same time was so deeply embedded in Aldo's culture and is still embedded in our culture. He didn't even recognize it as an option. What I want to argue tonight, though, is that living with nature is an option. And in fact, I'm going to try to press the case that it is the only viable option left to us at this point. You know, in the past, conservationists worked exclusively where people weren't. We wanted to conserve areas that weren't already spoiled by people. we need to flip that on its head. Now we need to conserve nature where people are. In other words, we got to find ways for nature to thrive in human-dominated landscapes. How are we going to do that? Where are we going to do it? Well, one place that we cannot ignore is private property. 85.6% of the US east of the Mississippi is privately owned. So if we didn't do any conservation on private property, we'd only be dealing with 15% of the land. And that is not nearly enough. That would give us those highly fragmented preserved places. So people who own property, own a piece of the earth, have got to participate in future conservation efforts. But there are a lot of areas that we don't consider to be conservation targets that could be. How about the rights of ways that are all around us? Power and pipeline rights of ways, railroad rights of ways, even roadsides. You're talking about millions of acres, 35 million acres there, just in rights of ways. Golf courses are 2 million acres, airports, 3 million acres. The Denver airport is twice the size of Manhattan. These are large areas on which we could do a lot of conservation. Then we have all the places where we live, and both in rural areas and suburbia and our urban centers, hundreds of millions of acres there. If you add up just those types of places, that's 599 million acres that we could be doing effective conservation on. How big is 599 million acres? Well, it's bigger than Vermont, plus New Jersey, plus Maine, Virginia, New York, Georgia, Florida, Oklahoma, Montana, California, even Texas is thrown in there. Add up all those areas, still less than 599 million acres. So finding a place to do conservation is not the issue. We can do conservation pretty much everywhere. What are we talking about when we're talking about conservation? We're really talking about restoration. We're talking about rebuilding nature, all parts of nature. But when you're putting it back together again, you've got to start with the building blocks, the species that other species depend on the most. All species don't contribute to ecosystem function equally. So let's start with the most important ones. And one of the first things we have to do is build a food web that transfers energy from plants. Plants capture the energy from the sun, but something's got to transfer that energy to other organisms. Most animals don't eat plants directly. They eat something that ate plants, and most of that something is insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. It turns out that caterpillars transfer more energy from plants to other organisms, particularly birds, than any other type of plant eater. So imagine what would happen if we took caterpillars out of the system. Many of those food webs would collapse. Carolina chickadees are a great example. A lot of people think of them as seed eaters because that's a bird that's at our feeder all winter long. But when they're reproducing, they're not eating seeds. Most birds cannot rear their young on seeds, so they switch to insect, and most of those insects are caterpillars when they're in a healthy environment. And it turns out that chickadees are not exceptions. Most of our birds, 96% of our terrestrial birds in North America, are rearing their young on insects, and it turns out most of those insects are caterpillars. How do we know that? Well, this is a study that was recently completed by Ashley Kennedy, one of my PhD students, where she had citizen science projects, some of you might have contributed to it, asking people from around the country to take pictures of birds while they were carrying prey items back to the nest, so during the breeding season. And you're looking at the distribution of prey items in 20 families of North American birds, 20 common families. The green bars represent the percentage of those nestling diets that were caterpillars. And in 16 of the 20 bird families, caterpillars dominated the nestling diet. So again, imagine what would happen if we took caterpillars out. Many of these birds wouldn't be able to reproduce at all, which means something special about caterpillars. So let's talk about what that might be. Well, one of the special things about caterpillars is that they're relatively soft prey items. Think of this guy as a sausage with a very thin wrapper. The thin wrapper is cuticle, it's exoskeleton, it is undigestible. So if you're a bird, you don't want a lot of cuticle. And then it's stuffed with very good things to eat. And of course, if it's soft, you can stuff it down the throat of your offspring without fear of injuring them. And if you've ever watched a parent bird rear its young, they're pretty rough. Their beak is like a plunger, they just stuff it down there. Caterpillars are also relatively large prey items. One medium-sized caterpillar is equal to the biomass of 200 aphids. And some of our smaller birds do chase aphids around. But do you want to chase 200 aphids, or do you want to eat one caterpillar? They're nutritious, very high in protein, very high in fats, very low percentage of chitin compared to many other insects, particularly beetles, which are not like little sausages, they're like little tanks. A great deal of inedible material, and they got a lot of sharp edges too. And it turns out the caterpillars are the best source of carotenoids for birds during the breeding season. And I mention carotenoids not because I love organic chemistry, but because I'm a vertebrate. And you're a vertebrate, and birds are vertebrates. And vertebrates cannot make their own carotenoids. We have to get them from plants. Yet they are essential components of our diets. And that's why my wife Cindy says I have to eat my carrots to get my beta carotene. And I have to eat my tomatoes to get my lycopene, and my whatever that is to get my lutein. And she makes sure that I get all of those wonderful things because they do so many things. They stimulate my immune system, and I cannot think of a better time to have a strong immune system. They're antioxidants. They run around our body and protect our DNA from oxidative damage. They improve color vision. When your mother said eat your carrots, you will see better, she was right. She didn't know she was right, but it turns out she was right. They improve sperm vitality. They improve sexual attractiveness. Now we're talking about particularly male birds like this prothonotary warbler, who has had access to lots of luteins. He takes those luteins, makes pigments out of them, and puts them in his feathers, and the brighter yellow he is from those luteins, the more ladies he attracts. Well, where are the birds getting their carotenoids? They're getting them from their prey items, but carotenoids are not distributed equally among invertebrate prey items. The first two bars here represent types of caterpillars, and they have far more carotenoids than anything else. The second most or highest level of carotenoids is found in orthopterans, the crickets and grasshoppers and katydids that are eating plant material directly. Look here, the adult caterpillars down here, the moths and butterflies, far lower in carotenoids because they're not eating green leaves directly. Whatever is in their body is left over from when they were caterpillars. And this is the earthworm way down here. So the early bird gets the worm, but he doesn't get any carotenoids when he gets the worm. Does this influence how birds choose their prey items? Well, it looks like it does. This is another study that Ashley Kennedy did. She worked with bluebirds for 3 years and put GoPro cameras on a lot of bluebird boxes that took a picture once every second. The idea was to catch the bluebird as it flew into the box with a prey item, or often they just sat on the roof of the box and got their picture taken. So she ended up with 7,000, she actually goes through more than 1 million pictures to get this, but she ended up with 7,628 pictures where she could identify the prey item. And there's a very good relationship between the amount of carotenoids that is in the prey item and the frequency with which it's brought back to the nest, with caterpillars being brought back more than anything else, followed by those orthopteroids, and then everybody else is nestled down here. So all this suggests that, at least for birds, caterpillars may not be optional parts of the diet. It's starting to look like they are essential parts of the diet. So, okay, birds need caterpillars, but how many do they need? That's an important question. How many caterpillars, for example, does a chickadee need? And it turns out from lots of research that chickadees are very typical of breeding birds. They need a lot, 1,000, 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars just to get the birds to the point where they fledge, and that depends on the number of chicks in the nest. And then the parents continue to feed them caterpillars another 24 days after they fledge. Now remember, chickadees, let's say you want a chickadee to breed in your yard. You put up a nest box. They're going to forage about 50 meters from the nest. So they need all of these caterpillars from your yard. They're not flying down the road 5 miles to the nearest woodlot. Many thousands of caterpillars. And when we don't landscape in a way that creates those caterpillars, in other words, when we destroy native plant communities that produce the caterpillars and insect populations decline, it's sure looking like birds decline as well. You know that paper that said we lost 3 billion birds? That was Rosenberg et al. In 2019. They posted their data online, and we've taken a look at it. And it turns out that all birds did not lose numbers, population size, equally. As a matter of fact, some birds actually gained in population size. And it is very well correlated with whether or not the birds require insects in their diet at some point in their life history. If they don't require insects, so things like the finches or the doves that can rear their young on seeds, they actually gained a little bit of population size. But the birds that required insects, and that's most of our birds, declined on average about 10 million individuals per species. So this doesn't prove cause and effect, but it sure shows there's a strong relation between the decline of birds and their requirement to eat insects. To me, this means we need to create landscapes that make a lot of caterpillars. It's that simple. So how do we do that? Well, we add caterpillars to landscapes by adding the plants that make them. That sounds easy enough, but there is a catch, and that is all plants don't make caterpillars equally. As a matter of fact, some make a lot and most don't make very many at all. Caterpillars are really fussy about which plants they eat. If all plants supported caterpillar growth equally, we could use any plant from anywhere, and landscaping would be a lot easier. But as the monarch here illustrates very well, you're not going to make monarchs by planting camellias or crepe myrtle or boxwood or any of the other Asian ornamentals that we love in our yards, because they are milkweed specialists. Most of the caterpillars have specialized on particular plant lineages, so we need to put those lineages in our yards. Why do we have so many host plant specialists? Well, plants don't want to be eaten. They want to capture the energy from the sun and use it for their own growth and reproduction, so they have loaded their leaves, their tissues, with nasty tasting chemicals, secondary metabolic compounds that make those tissues either bitter or downright toxic. And if you don't believe me, go outside when it stops raining and eat a plant and see if you like it. You're not going to like it. All plants protect themselves chemically, and that's why it's green out there. It's been an amazingly effective defense. It's not green because there are no insects that want to eat those plants. It's green because most of the insects that are out there cannot eat most of the plants. They are simply too well protected chemically. There is a reason that it's difficult to get our kids to eat vegetables. They inherently know that they are toxic. You can see my face. You can see that's a joke. Well, this is not a joke. Insects do eat plants. So how do they do that? How do they get around those chemical defenses? That's a good question. This is where the specialization comes in. They cannot get around the defenses of all the plants. So they pick one or two plant lineages that share a common cocktail of chemical defenses, and they develop the adaptations over evolutionary time that allow them to get around those defenses. Things like the enzymes that store and excrete and detoxify those compounds, the behavioral adaptations, the life history adaptations that minimize the exposure of those caterpillars to the various toxins, and that allows them to eat these plants without dying. Important point here, though, is that it takes a long period of exposure to those plant lineages for all these adaptations to fall into place. It does not happen overnight. All I'm saying is that plant choice matters. When we're trying to rebuild nature in our human-dominated landscapes, we have to choose the plants that are going to create the nature that we want to maintain. And I'm going to give you 3 examples of how well this works. I'm going to start with our property. My wife Cindy and I live in Oxford, Pennsylvania, where we have 10 acres. It was a farm that was carved up some years ago. The area was mowed for hay. Actually, it had been in farming 300 years before we got it. Most of the topsoil is gone, washed down in a gully over here, but then it was mowed for hay. And this is what it looked like just before we moved in. But on most of the property, this is what it looked like. All the invasive plants from Asia were everywhere. The whole place looked like Sleeping Beauty's castle. Multiflora rose and oriental bittersweet and Japanese honeysuckle and bush honeysuckle and autumn olive and privet and barberry and miscanthus and porcelain berry and calorie pear, and you know all these things. That's Cindy. She's getting ready to clear it all out. So you might look at your property and say, oh, that's impossible, I can't do it. Well, Cindy can do it, so you can do it. You just start at the corner and just push them back. What was I doing? I was putting plants back. And I was having fun doing it because I put the plants back that brought particular caterpillars that I thought ought to be at our house that weren't there. They weren't there because their host plant wasn't there. And one of the ones I targeted was Canadian owlets. A beautiful caterpillar there. That's what the adult looks like. Not so beautiful, but it's a great example of crypsis blending in with the leaves on the forest floor. Well, how do you get Canadian owlets? You have to have meadow rue. We didn't have any meadow rue. I still don't know where there's any meadow rue around us here. So I got some seeds from somebody else, planted some meadow rue. And, you know, I thought it would actually take years before the Canadian owlet would find my meadow rue. Maybe it had to come down from Canada, I don't know. So I didn't go out and check it. I knew it had germinated, was growing nicely, but after a month or 2 months, I did go out and check it. It was almost defoliated with Canadian owlets. They had found it right away. I was impressed. So now we have, this is several years later, we have a thriving population of Canadian owlets and meadow rue. Same thing with the goldenrod stowaway. That's a misnomer. This beautiful moth has nothing to do with goldenrod. It is a specialist on Biden's Aristosa, ditch daisy. We didn't have any ditch daisy, but I got some seeds, planted them. We now have a lot of ditch daisy and a thriving population of goldenrod stowaway. I wanted hackberry emperor because it's a butterfly that ought to be on our property. But as you might suspect, hackberry emperor requires hackberry. And we didn't have any hackberry, so I planted hackberry. Planted about 7 of them. Another rousing success. It actually took a couple years for them to find it. But I went out this June, looked at one of the branches on my hackberries, and there were 9 hackberry emperor caterpillars on it. Goldenrod, I did not plant goldenrod. It came in on its own, and along with it came the things that eat goldenrod, like the beautiful brown-hooded owlet, the Arcidra flower moth, the goldenrod leaf miner, the distinct Sparagnithus, the goldenrod gall moth. Now here's one that hasn't come yet, the goldenrod flower moth, and its beautiful larvae. This is anticipation. Every year I wait for the goldenrod flower moth, and they haven't come yet. So it's like waiting for the ketchup to come out. But one of these years they're going to come, and it'll be a great day. Same thing, planted Virginia creeper because it supports so many beautiful caterpillars. I want to take a picture of the Pandora Sphinx. First year, there it was, and it's equally beautiful adult. But I got other things that feed on Virginia creeper, like the lettered sphinx, the hog sphinx, the abbot sphinx. Same thing with the zebra swallowtail. I think it's our prettiest swallowtail, but they're specialists on pawpaw. We didn't have pawpaw. So we planted pawpaw, and we got lots of pawpaw. We had to wait 9 years for this butterfly to find us. The nearest population was 26 miles away, but they did. So we had our pawpaws, but in the meantime, we got the pawpaw sphinx. As a matter of fact, just before this talk, went outside, and there was a pawpaw sphinx on one of our pawpaws. So again, we got lots of pawpaws too. One of the double-tooth prominence, so we planted American elm, got that right away. We wanted the evening primrose moth, so we planted evening primrose, and the adults sit in the flowers. It's all day long, very easy to find them. And we planted lots of oaks. So these are just a smattering of the things we put into our yard. This is the Bedford Oak in Bedford, New York. And people argue about whether it's 400 years old or 500 years old. I don't know, but it's huge. And a lot of people think that your oak has to be gigantic before it can contribute to your property. I've heard people say, I'm not going to plant an oak, I won't live long enough to enjoy it. Well, the animals around you will enjoy it almost immediately. I planted oaks mostly from acorns, but a few bare root whips, and immediately things like the solitary oak leaf miner, juvenile's dusky wing, the yellow-shouldered moth, the orange-headed epicalema, the red-washed caterpillar, the yellow-vested moth, the orange-tufted oneida, the spiny oak caterpillar, the two-spotted oak punky, the variable oak leaf caterpillar, the red-humped oakworm, the orange-humped oakworm, the pink-striped oakworm, the delightful dagger moth, the pleasant dagger moth, the lesser oak dagger moth, the greater oak dagger moth, the streaked dagger moth, the afflicted dagger moth, the crown bucolatrix, the white blotch heterocampa, the oblique heterocampa, the red line panapoda, the laugher, and literally hundreds more species have come to my oaks, even though they started out really small. Like this one. This is a pin oak, first year of growing, and here's a caterpillar standing on the ground eating it anyway. So your oaks contribute. You know what that is? That's bird food. They're making bird food immediately. This is a picture taken from the same place that the other picture was taken from, and obviously we have put plants back. We do have some lawn. We're very traditional there, but so many moth species, which are really, they're the crux of the food web. Not so much butterflies, but moths have come to our property that I made it a goal, have been making it a goal to take pictures of every species that I find. I've been doing it for about 4 years, and I am now up to 1,012 species of moths that I have pictures of that came to our property because we put these plants back. That's 1,012 species of bird food on our property. And because we have so much bird food, we have recorded 55 species of birds that have bred on our 10 acres. Earlier this week, we saw this headline. Did you see this? World Wildlife Fund says 2/3 of wildlife have vanished since 1970. Not at our house. Not at our house. As a matter of fact, I'll bet we have increased wildlife at our house by 2/3 simply by putting the plants back. I know what you're thinking, though. Can this work in suburbia? Most people don't own 10 acres. I understand that, and that's a good question. Let's go to Margie and Dan Terpster's house in Kirkwood, Missouri. They have 0.6 acres, so less than 1 acre. They are in a typical suburban neighborhood surrounded by people with giant lawns and nothing else. The major invasive plant in Kirkwood, Missouri is bush honeysuckle. So the first thing they did was get rid of their bush honeysuckle. Then they planted a lot of native plants, and they put in a bubbler, a water feature, that's very attractive to birds. And then they sat back and started to count those birds. They're up to 149 bird species that have visited their yard. And that includes 35 warbler species. To put that into perspective, we've recorded only 8 warbler species at our house so far. 0.6 acres, it works, it works. What about in urban yards? Let's go to Pam Carlson's yard in Chicago. And I mean in Chicago. She lives right next to one of the runways of O'Hare Airport, right next to Kennedy Expressway. She has 1/10 of an acre, which is 3 times smaller than the average lot size for North America. Got rid of her invasive plants, put in 60 species of native plants. Now remember, there is no connectivity with her yard and any natural area at all. She is an island, but she has recorded 116 species of birds that have used her yard, including a woodcock. So if you haven't seen a woodcock lately, you can go to Pam's house in Chicago and check it out. But what about in the middle of a city? 82% of the US now lives in cities. Are they going to miss out? Well, in 2014, I was staring at this plant, this Asclepias tuberosa, that we call butterfly weed. But that reminds me, we have a serious marketing issue with our native plants. We call them weeds and then wonder why people don't plant them. So we're going to change the name. This is not butterfly weed anymore. This is Monarch's Delight. I was staring at Monarch's Delight, and the first thing I saw was this megachilid bee, a leafcutter bee. I know it's a leafcutter bee because it carries its pollen on its tummy, not on its legs. Well, leafcutter bees, I hadn't seen this species in a long time. So I was happy about that. But leafcutter bees have very specific requirements. They not only do they need pollen and nectar, but they need soft leaves because they cut the edges of those leaves out and they roll them up and stuff them full of pollen and then put that in, into a crack, and that's how they rear their young. So leaves like redbud are perfect for leafcutter bees. Well, there was redbud growing right there next to Monarch's Delight, so the leafcutter bees had everything they need. And because there was redbud there that bloomed very early in the spring, overwintering bumblebee queens had what they needed. Bumblebee queens have to do all the work in the beginning. There are no workers yet. So they've got to do all the foraging, and they need a lot of forage early in the spring so they can start their colonies. Well, they were able to do it because of the redbud. Well, about 5 minutes later, I saw a monarch. Now, this was June 2014. I had gone all of 2013 without seeing a single monarch. Remember, monarchs 2013 hit their lowest population point. Only 3.6% of what was here in 1976 remained. And we don't see monarchs up as far north as where I live. In June, they just don't get up there yet. But yet there was that monarch and then another guy. They were there because they had Monarch's Delight, and they also had other species of milkweed. So I was really impressed. You know where I was? I was on the High Line in the middle of Manhattan, New York. There's the Monarch's Delight right there. And that is the bit of nature we're talking about here. This is an elevated railroad that has been converted to a tourist destination, and they had designed it largely with native plants, but not entirely with native plants. And now literally millions of people visit the High Line all year round in the middle of in the middle of a big city. So I was impressed because I knew there were pretty plants there, but I didn't think that wildlife would be able to find those plants and use them effectively. But I was completely wrong. If thoughtful native plants can bring some life to the middle of Manhattan, we can do it anywhere. We can do it anywhere. But there are 4 things we need to consider if we're going to succeed. And the first one is the amount of lawn that we have in the US. We've got to shrink the lawn. We have over 40 million acres of lawn, and that's actually an aging statistic at this point. I think we have a lot more than that. That's the size of New England. That is a deadscape like this. This is a status symbol, and it's a very unhealthy status symbol ecologically. So I'm suggesting that we cut that area in half. The area of lawn we keep, we'll still manicure it, we can still have a high status, but we're going to plant the rest of the area. And if we cut it in half, that'll be 20 million acres that we have now to create. If we do it at home, we can create a new national park. We call it Homegrown National Park, just by cutting our lawn in half. And that will be bigger than the Adirondacks, plus Yellowstone, plus Yosemite, Grand Tetons, Canyonlands, Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Badlands National Park, Olympic National Park, Sequoia National Park, plus the Grand Canyon, plus Denali, which is huge, plus the Great Smoky Mountains. Add up all those parks, still less than 20 million acres. And there are a number of real serious benefits from bringing nature to the place where you live. Building that park right at home. One of the biggest one is that it allows you to develop or reestablish a personal relationship with the natural world whenever you get the time to do it at your own pace. And you can do it avoiding crowds. It's free and it's never closed, no matter how many pandemics come down the road. No travel hassles. Here's a big one. You get to experience the natural world alone. And you know, I'm believe it or not, I'm somewhat of an introvert. I need to do it alone. I think a lot of people do. Otherwise, you're experiencing other people and not the natural world. And this is so important for our kids. Richard Louv writes about our kids suffering from nature deficit disorder. So what are we doing? We're putting them on a bus with a teacher, 30 kids on a bus, and we take them to some natural area and they walk around for an hour and the teacher tells them not to touch anything. Then they get back on the bus and they go home, and that's their experience with the natural world. I'm sure it's better than nothing, but it's really an experience with 30 other kids and a teacher telling them not to touch anything. If we put some nature right where those kids live, they get to experience when they are ready without any interference from any adult. It means they get to hunt lizards. I'm learning this from my granddaughter. This is Zoe, who lives in Hawaii. And her patch of nature is about 10 feet by 10 feet. It's a lawn and a hedge. But this is how you hunt lizards, she tells me. You get down on the ground and you crawl very slowly and you disguise yourself with leaves and sticks. You sneak up on the lizards. The lizards are little anoles. They really are there. You can wear your best dress. That's okay. But she does this, and she invented this game, and she has a wonderful time with it. And believe me, to the day she dies, she will remember hunting lizards in Hawaii. That's the type of relationship I'm talking about our kids establishing. If you want to do more than hunt lizards, you can get this book, Nature Play at Home by Nancy Stranici, where she outlines a number of wonderful activities that kids can do in very small spaces right at home. So we're going to shrink the lawn. Then what are we going to put in the area that's no longer lawn? We're going to put, at least some of the plants have to be keystone plants. What's a keystone plant? Well, it turns out that a few native plants are much better at supporting the life around us than most other native plants. Those are the keystone plants. About 5% of our native plants are making about 75% of the caterpillar food that drives food webs. 14% of our native plants are making 90% of the caterpillar food. So the question is no longer simply, are natives better than non-natives? On average, most natives are better than non-natives in terms of supporting food webs. But I could build a 100% native yard that supports very little, because there are a lot of natives that aren't doing a whole lot. So what we really need to think about is, do we want ecologically productive plants in our yard, or ecologically benign plants, or even worse, ecologically destructive plants? All of those ornamentals that are invasive, they escape into our natural areas. I get an email once or twice a year from somebody saying, don't you know that ginkgos, Ginkgo biloba from Asia, actually grew in North America 7 million years ago? And then the email will go on to say, that means they're native, and that means I can plant them and everything will be great. This isn't our metric anymore. It's not whether they're native or not. I don't care if ginkgos grew on the moon 7 million years ago. They produce 0 caterpillar species. It's what they look like. There's never anything eaten out of. So it's a tree, but it's not supporting the life around you. That's the metric that we need to use when we're trying to choose our plants. The number one plant in 84% of the counties of North America is quercus. The oaks, they support 900 species of caterpillars nationwide, 900 species of bird food, 557 species where I live, the mid-Atlantic states, and a lot of species in, I think it's 510, something like that, in Georgia. So let me give you an example of the power of keystone plants in my yard with those moths that I already told you about. If I've got 112 species of moths that I have taken pictures of, and I'm not done, by the way, there's more than that. Out of the 1,012 species, there's 888 that have known host plants. So there's over 100 that we don't know what they're eating. But of the ones we do know what they're eating, 262 species use oaks. And we have 59 genera of native woody plants on our property, and only one of them is the oaks, the quercus. And we have hundreds of genera of herbaceous plants. So oaks represent less than 2% of our woody plant diversity and way less than 1% of the total plant diversity, yet they're supporting about 29% of our moth species, almost 30%. So imagine what would happen if we took that one genus of plants out of our property. That's the power of a keystone plant. How do you find out what the keystone plants are where you live? You go to Native Plant Finder on the National Wildlife Federation website, and you put in your zip code, and the ranked list of plants ranked in terms of their ability to create caterpillars where you live will pop up for your county. So here's just a smattering. This is a typical list. This is very close to what you would find in Georgia. Notice I say native oaks, native cherries, native willows. You can go to the nursery and you can buy a Chinese oak. You can buy an English oak. You can easily get Asian cherries. The willow most people sell is weeping willow from the Middle East. When you do that, even though these species are members of native genera, they're non-native congeners, and you're reducing the caterpillar use on these plants by 68%. Why you would need to get a non-native oak, I have no idea, because we've got 90 species of oaks. You'd think we'd be able to find one that works well in your area. And then here are the most powerful herbaceous plants. Goldenrod's always way up there. Aster's way up there. Our sunflower is way up there. And I don't know if it's coincidentally or not, goldenrods, by the way, support 110 species of caterpillars, 110 species of bird food. They're also making bird seed, so are our asters, so are our sunflowers, and they're supporting specialist bees. 30 some species of specialist bees just on those genera. So very powerful plants to put in your landscape. All right, we're going to shrink the lawn. We're going to use keystone plants. And when we use keystone plants, we're going to bring a lot of moths to our property. And if we have light pollution on, it'll kill those moths. 100 years of studying why insects go to lights at night. And we still don't know the answer. But light pollution turns out to be one of the most serious factors decreasing insect populations, because we've got lights on all over the place. How do they kill insects? Well, by exhaustion. The insects fly around the light, around until they run out of energy. They collide with the light bulb and get incinerated. They die of dehydration. Increased predation. The bats come down and pick them off. It blinds a lot of those insects. Who knew? And then it ruins their daily activities that they need to reproduce. So as I said, there's a lot of data particularly from Europe, suggesting that light pollution around the globe is seriously reducing insect populations. The easiest thing to do is to turn off our lights. But I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, I have to have lights on at night because they're my security lights. If I don't have lights on, the bad man will come. Okay, put a motion sensor on your security light, so it only turns on when the bad man does come. And the first thing you will notice is how often the bad man does not come. If you don't want to do that, switch out the white light of your security light and put in a yellow light bulb, because yellow wavelengths are far less attractive to insects than our white wavelengths. And yellow LED lights are the least important of all. The least attractive of all to insects. If we switched out our light bulbs overnight, we could save billions of species of insects with very little effort. All right, Fourth thing we need to do is to complete our landscape by landscaping in a way that allows the caterpillars that we have brought to our property to complete their development so that they can continue on with the next generation. What do I mean by that? Well, we have 511 species of, I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, where there are 511 species of caterpillars that develop on oaks, a lot of species. A few of them complete their development on the tree itself, like the polyphemus moth. So here's a caterpillar that's eating the leaves. When it finishes, it spins its cocoon and hangs from a branch, and then it emerges as an adult and goes and does it again. So everything that happens happens on that tree. And I wish everything did that, but it's not the case. About 480 species, 94% of what's using oaks in Chester County, Pennsylvania, fall from the tree and wiggle themselves below the ground where they pupate underground, or they spin a cocoon in the leaf litter that is under the tree. And the problem is we don't have any leaf litter under the tree, and the ground that's under most of our ornamental trees is compacted and mowed, and caterpillars can't get underground. It's no man's land. So this becomes an ecological trap. We call in the caterpillars, they're the adult moths, and they lay their eggs. The caterpillars develop, they drop to the ground, and then they die. And the next generation, there's far fewer of them. It's another major reason we've got insect declines. And of course, the cement landscape is going to be even less favorable for caterpillar development. I'm not trying to discourage the use of trees in cities, but I am trying to discourage the use of cement as a landscape option. That's just laziness. And it ruins our watersheds as well. This is what happens most of the time. We stick a tree in the middle of a big lawn, and nobody has measured the success rate of caterpillars trying to complete their development in a situation like this. But I guarantee it's much higher in a situation like this, where you have a tree and then you have a layered landscape. Here's a native azalea, and you've got wonderful native azaleas down in Georgia. You could have a dogwood over here, some understory tree, ferns, ground covers. The caterpillar drops down and it's in a safe zone. Nobody's going to squish it. Nobody's going to mow it. The ground is not compacted there. This is where you can do your fancy spring ephemeral gardening. Again, safe zones for caterpillars. And of course, you're not wrecking the tree base with your lawnmower either when you build beds around your trees. You can put your ground covers there, like wild ginger or mayapple or foam flower. So many options there. Again, they're all safe sites. There's good news in the ability to choose plants for our landscapes, and that is there really is room for compromise. And this is coming from another PhD student, Desiree Nrango, who's graduated at this point, but she worked in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. on Carolina chickadees. And her question was, how well can chickadee populations reproduce themselves? How well can they be sustained in landscapes that are dominated by non-native ornamentals versus suburban landscapes dominated by native plants? So she compared those two types of landscapes. None of the native landscapes were 100% native. There were some of the other landscapes that were 100% introduced, actually a lot of them. The first thing she found is that the landscapes with introduced plants produce 75% fewer caterpillars. So right away, there's 75% less bird food available for the chickadees. Those landscapes were 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees at all. So even though she had nest boxes up in all these yards, the chickadees would come and they'd look around and say, there's not enough food here. We're not even going to try. If they did try, those nests contained 1.5 fewer eggs. The clutches were 29% less likely to survive at all, less likely to reach fledging. If they did reach fledging, they produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and it took them 1.5 days longer to get to fledging. And you might say, well, those aren't huge differences, but if you put all that together in a population growth model, this is what it looks like as a function of the percentage of non-native plant biomass in your landscape, from no non-native plants to 100% non-native plants. This dotted line is replacement rate. This is the rate at which the population must make babies in order to replace the adults that die every year. Chickadees don't live that long, so some adults are always dying. You've got to make that many babies. And if that balances out, you've got a sustainable population. The population isn't growing, but it's not shrinking either. So it can go on that way forever. If you make more babies than parents dying, you've got a growing population, but if you make fewer, you've got a shrinking population. Right here is where those lines intersect, right around 30% non-native plants. So if you have at least 70% of the native plant or the plant biomass on your property as being productive native plants, you can have sustainable populations. But if you have more than 30% non-native plants, you're going to have an unsustainable declining population. I'm excited about this study for two reasons. It's the first time that we have studied this for any bird anywhere. So if anybody's doubting that your choice of plants actually impact the ability of birds to reproduce in your yard, this study ought to convince you. But it also suggests an area of compromise. That's right in here. You can have your camellias, you can have your crepe myrtle or your ginkgo, as long as it's not more than 30% of the plant biomass on your property. Which is good news to me, because if I said you're not allowed to have any non-native plants, very few people would be listening. We love our ornamental plants. Can we use native plants formally? Of course we can. Somebody sent me this picture in the spring, and I have lost track of the email. I don't know who it was, but it's the land manager of this formal garden. And what he's doing is sneaking in native plants into the planting. This is Joe Pye. I'm not going to call it Joe Pye weed. I'm just going to call it Joe Pye. And his goal is to change out all of the plantings here and make them native, just to demonstrate that you can have a formal native garden. Remember, formality is a function of the design. It's not a function of the plants in the design. Our native plants are used in formal designs in Europe every day. And I guess it's okay over there because they're non-native plants over there. Can we get a pollinator garden into a traditional suburban lot like this without the neighbors having a problem? Of course we can. You put a little fence around it. It formalizes it. It's beautiful. It provides a number of different types of pollen for a number of different types of bees. And if everybody did this, our native bee population would be much happier than it is today. You don't have to have a fence around it, but here's a very nicely edged plot. Imagine the life that is here compared to the life that is here. These designs, by the way, are by Drew Latham, but you can do it as well. Heather Holm writes about native bees, a couple books on native bees you can get on Amazon. She sent me this picture of her yard when she moved in. She got rid of the hardscape here and the lawn and put in plants that are going to support the native bees that she studies. So we all can do it. Can municipalities help us live with nature? Of course they can. There are a number of programs, increasing number of programs around the country. This is just a few. State of Minnesota has a cost sharing program that is encouraging homeowners to replace part or all of their lawn with appropriate prairie plantings, and the state helps you pay for that. Florida is encouraging people to allow burrowing owls, that's a listed species, to burrow in their yards, in their front yards. They're paying them to allow the owls to do that. This is the way the Endangered Species Act should have been written, with carrots rather than sticks. If you've got an endangered species on your property, you get a tax break. Everybody would want an endangered species. We'd be much better off than rather than punishing people and saying you can't use your property because there's an invasive species there. State of Missouri, I don't know if they still do, but they had a bounty program with calorie pears. If you brought in the body of a calorie pear, they gave you a free tree replacement. Of course, calorie pears are highly invasive ornamentals, you know that. And of course, the dry areas in the West, California, Arizona in particular, have lawn reducing programs where you get so many dollars per square foot if you convert your water thirsty lawn into an appropriate xeric planting. I think we've made three missteps in the early years of conservation. And early years I consider to be last century. We have assumed that nature is important. Most of us like nature, but it's not essential. So if it disappears, we'll be sad, we'll miss it, but it won't really matter. I went to the Cincinnati Zoo before the virus broke out, and this was a wall-sized poster that reflects what I think our entire culture talks about all the time. And I'm talking about the language from top conservationists too. We need to save wildlife so the future generations can enjoy it, which suggests to me that nature is there just for entertainment. No, nature is there. It's far more than for entertainment. We need to have healthy natural systems so that we have future generations. Sounds dramatic, but that's really what it's looking like. Second misstep is that we've assumed that humans and nature cannot coexist. Now, I talked about this, but that if we restrict our conservation efforts to untouched areas, we've condemned them to failure because those areas will be too small, too isolated from each other to actually sustain the species that are within them for very long. David Quammen has a really great analogy between a Persian rug and an ecosystem. This is a functional Persian rug. This is not 71 Persian rugs. It's 71 rug fragments, not one of which is functioning like a Persian rug. And that's what we've done to our ecosystems. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance. And I hate that terminology because it suggests there are places on planet Earth that have no ecological significance. There's certainly places where we've destroyed the ecological significance, but every place has ecological significance, including our yards, including our corporate landscapes, including our roadsides, every place. And we have to return the ecological function to those places. What that means is we've got to glue our rug back together again by putting the plants back, restoring the ecological value of all those places in between these habitat fragments that are left. And we're not just going to build biological corridors where plants and animals can move back and forth between good habitat. We're going to build habitat that is so good they can actually live there. We're going to do that by using those keystone plants that I talked about. Our third misstep was to leave Earth stewardship to a few specialists. Conservation biologists, ecologists. We didn't see it as an inherent responsibility of every human being on the planet. And I don't know why, because every human being on the planet depends entirely on the quality of Earth's ecosystems. So why wouldn't everybody bear the responsibility for good Earth stewardship? It doesn't mean you have to save biodiversity for a living, but you really can save it where you live. I like this approach because it empowers each one of us. You know that we have enormous environmental issues on the planet today, and most people feel entirely powerless. But with this approach, you are not powerless. You can go out and plant that keystone plant, plant that oak, plant that black cherry, any one of the powerhouse plants, and I can come to your house the next day and measure the wildlife that has come there. So everybody as an individual is now an important component of the future of conservation. It also shrinks the problem down to something that's manageable for each one of us. Don't think about the entire planet's problems. You will get depressed if you do that. Just worry about the piece of planet Earth that you can impact. If you own a piece of property, shrink the lawn. Get rid of your invasive plants, put your pollinator gardens in there and use those keystone plants. And remember, if everybody that owned property did that, we'd be 85% done east of the Mississippi. So very, very powerful. And if you don't own land, let's say you live in the middle of Atlanta, volunteer at one of our parks or preserves. They're all understaffed, they're all underfunded, they love volunteers. And then you can make your impact there. So as property owners or as volunteers, each one of us has the power, and we certainly have the responsibility to fix dead landscapes like this. Whether or not we decide to do so is going to determine nature's fate. And I've convinced my grandchildren that you are nature's best hope, and I hope I've convinced you as well. Thanks very much. I'm done.
Thank you, Doug. I'm sorry I was on mute. Forgot to unmute myself.
Okay.
We have several questions. Thank you very much. We have lots of questions coming in. So if you have questions, please ask them in the Q&A. We are going to try to get to them. Gabe is going to ask you the first question that's going to come in, so we're going to kind of rotate them.
All right, so your first question is, when you began to transition your space, did you treat the soil in any way, or did you bring in new soil? Someone is converting their lawn into a garden, and they think that there are some dead zones from many years of depleting the topsoil by bagging leaves. What's the best way to address this quickly?
Yeah, that's a good question. As I said, most of our topsoil had washed away, had been overfarmed for hundreds of years. And then even around the house, the bulldozer scraped the rest of it away. So we were dealing with subsoil in a lot of places. Where I live, the township collects leaves off the curb, takes them to a central site, composts them for a year, and then puts them out for people to come and bag up. And that's what I used for soil amendment. I went and loaded my little pickup with this black gold, I called it. And when I planted a tree, that was the mulch around it. That was wonderful. I mean, that inoculated the soil with any of the mycorrhizae that we needed. Well, we've been here 20 years now, but our soil in some places is excellent. And some of the areas in the front yard are practically serpentine barrens. So that soil doesn't support particular plants, but that's a great way to do it. And that's easy to do. Maintain the leaves that come to your yard. And if you have no trees with no leaves, go around and pick up the ones that your neighbors throw away all the time. Well, everybody's throwing away their leaves. That is the best source of natural nutrients for your plants. Native plants from North America don't like a lot of fertilizer. So it's a very common mistake to over-fertilize. You don't need to do that. So put your plants in. If the soil is terrible, they'll be slow in the beginning, but they will be inoculated with the things that they need and build soil over time.
Great. Next question is from Jeffrey, and he wants to know if there is a blueprint somewhere to help transform open lawns to native forests.
No, because that's a design question. Where should the trees go? What kind of exposure do you have? What is the viewscape from your house and at your house? And those are individual choices that each person can make. So there's no one design that works for everybody. But a lot of people want to know about the process. If you're starting with a lawn, what do you do first? Before the virus, I'd go around and give a lot of talks, and people say, oh, I'm going to rip out my whole lawn. I'd say, no, don't do that, because then you got to replace it right away with something. What I would do is, particularly in the East here where it's appropriate, I would start by adding trees to your property. There are very few properties that have as many trees as we ought to have. And if you add a single tree each year and build a bed around it, you have reduced the area that's in lawn around that tree, and you started to put back ecosystem function, as opposed to ripping out huge parts of your lawn. Now, if you have a lot of energy and if you want to do it fast, it's going to cost you something. But what I do is start small. As I said, I started with acorns, and but many of my oak trees at this point, it's been 20 years, but many of them are over 40 feet tall at this point. I can have a picnic under them. I mean, they are real trees. So plants grow. You just have to be a little bit patient in the beginning, and then it's free. You don't have to spend a lot of money. But I would add trees and reduce your lawn that way, and then build those beds around those trees.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Cindy, and she wants to get your opinion on the species that are labeled as cultivars, improved cultivars, and are those the most beneficial compared to, I guess, a straight native plant?
It depends on the goal. In the past, we have viewed plants strictly as decorations, and a lot of people think many of our native plants are too leggy, and so the horticultural trade has looked for the prettiest plants. If that's your only goal, make it pretty, and sometimes those pretty plants were natural variants that were found in nature, but they put a name on it and call it a cultivar. There was no active selection. And other times we actively selected for traits that enhanced beauty. Well, if you're planning for ecological function, then beauty is not the primary goal. You can still find a pretty plant, but you want to make sure you maintain that function. So are these cultivars as functional as the straight species? Not many people have looked at this. We did do a study looking at 6 traits, none of which involve flowers. These were all with woody plants. And the traits were, if you take a tall plant and make it short, what happens to the things that eat that plant? If you enhance berry size, if you enhance fall color, if you take a green leaf and make it red or purple, or introduce leaf variegation, introduce disease resistance. Those were the traits we looked at. We put in the straight species in a common garden and surround it with its cultivars, and then measure insect use over a 3-year period. And we found that the only trait that consistently reduced insect use was taking green leaves and making them red or purple, which is a very common cultivar. Everybody loves those red leaves plants. I don't know why. I think they're ugly, but because that loads the leaves with anthocyanins, which are feeding deterrents. The other cultivar changes did not affect the insects at all. I was surprised, but it didn't. So in terms of those traits that we looked at, that's good news, except cultivars are typically maintained by cloning. So when you buy a cultivar, you're buying a plant with 0 genetic variability. And if we load our landscapes with plants with 0 genetic variability, that puts them at a serious disadvantage, particularly in this day and age with wild climate swings that we're getting. We need as much genetic variability out there as possible. But a lot of cultivars are created around flowers, and Annie White at the University of Vermont has been looking at that. And there the news is not so great. The answer is still, it depends, because some cultivar changes to flowers don't do anything to pollinators, but most of them do deter pollinators in some way, particularly those specialist pollinators. You know, we have 4,000 species of native bees, and at least almost half of them are specialists. They have very close relationships with particular plants. If we change the flowers of those particular plants, the specialist bees don't know what to do with it. So often what happens is the generalist bees will come, and people see honeybees and bumblebees and they think that they've saved all the pollinators, but that's just a few species, and most of the native bees have been lost. So I would say ask your nursery to get you the straight species. A lot of them don't carry them. But if they realize there's a market for straight species because people are now landscaping for function, they'll start to carry them. And that way, you know, you're always going to be safe with the straight species. You know that one works.
Yeah, so going off the end of that question, somebody asked about how all the major, you know, plant carrying places mostly carry a lot of ornamental invasives. And can you go a little further about talking about how we can try and start to address this?
85% of the woody invasive plants in this country are sold at nurseries, or were. Actually, fewer nurseries are carrying them these days, in part because there are a number of states that have banned them. State of Maryland, Massachusetts, Connecticut has banned a number of plants. I mean, places like Oregon has now banned the sale of English ivy. That's okay, except nobody's buying it anyway because it's already everywhere. You know, that's closing the barn door way after the horse is gone. So waiting till something is demonstrably invasive is then you know, it's very tough to reverse it. So this is all market driven. If we stopped buying the invasive plants, they would stop carrying them. So it's the consumer really needs to get a list of the invasive plants in your area, and there's really not that many of them. I mean, in your area, everybody knows privet is highly invasive, and are you going to go buy another privet plant and just add more seeds to your natural areas? Probably not. And if we started to get rid of those invasive ornamentals, you know, I've had people say, well, my burning bush hasn't moved from my property. It's still there. So, yeah, it is still there, but the thousands of seeds it makes each year are not still there. The birds eat those seeds and then go poop them out in the natural areas. So you might not think your plant is moving, but it really is. So get rid of those plants. Those are seed sources, and that will be a start in terms of minimizing this problem. But the real answer is to stop buying them. Although I have heard people in the nursery industry say, I wish there was top-down regulation so that it's not up to your conscience. If one nurseryman stops selling privet, for example, but the other guy doesn't, and people want to go buy privet, then the responsible nurseryman is going to lose out. If there's a rule that says nobody can sell it, everybody's on an equal equal footing. So that's what a lot of people are asking for. So maybe you can get your state legislators to get a little bit more serious about trying to get control on this. As birders, it's really, really important. Those plants, bush honeysuckle, those things are just leveling, reducing, eliminating the bird food in our forests, particularly the understory for so many of our birds.
A follow-up for the a follow-up for your regulation question. Somebody's talking about there's been a number of movements in cities around both the city of Atlanta and in smaller cities around the metro area to rewrite tree protection ordinances. And a question has come in about do you have any ideas for how we could encode the ideas that you've presented in your talk into a protect and preserve ordinance for trees in the South?
A few people have done that. Somebody sent me an ordinance that was written and accepted for, I think it was Gaithersburg, Maryland. I have it on my computer. If you're interested, I could send it to you. So it's all done, it's all written, and somebody found it acceptable. And that would be a good place to start. That's all I can say. I've never written one myself, but there are municipalities doing it, and it's, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's use something that's worked.
So here's an interesting question. A lot of us either actively use or may have it left over from someone who lived there previously, some of that landscape fabric in our yards. How does that affect insect use, and should we remove all of the landscape fabric that's in our house, in our landscapes?
Yeah, that's another good question that I've never gotten. Of course, that's there to prevent weeds from coming up. If you're trying to establish a bed where you're going to remove lawn and you want to minimize weeding. So, that's one of the things that mulch is used for. A lot of people go out and buy bark mulch, but the weeds always come up through that. What you really want is a bed that is planted so thickly that the plants are the mulch and you can't see the ground, and that will minimize your weeding. If you have landscape fabric underneath that, that's a real battle. That means all your roots are going to grow on top of the landscape fabric, and they can do that for a while, but you won't have anything deep rooted, which is a problem in any next time we get a drought, and we will get droughts again. That's where you're going to lose plants. It depends on how big the area is. I probably would try to get rid of it if I'm starting from scratch. If it's everywhere and I'd have to dig up a whole bunch of plants to do it, then I'd be lazy about it too. Maybe cut it out where you can, but.
All right. Annalise asks, what advice do you have for someone who's dealing with decades of overgrowth of invasives like kudzu, autumn olive, nandina, and privet? For example, they've ripped out 75 nandina this year, but have probably 150 to 200 more. When do you advocate the use of herbicides and recommend a process that might make the transformation a bit easier? One person without a budget makes it tough. Any advice for that situation?
Well, of course, this is the question that gets me in trouble every time, because there are a lot of people that dead set against any use of herbicide, and I understand that. I think of herbicide as chemotherapy. If you don't kill the invasive plant roots, it will come back. And when Cindy and I moved into our property, that was us. We were not going to use any herbicide. I had a Oriental bittersweet vine that was almost as thick as my laptop computer here, and it was going up one of the few trees we had along a fence row, where he was going to pull down that tree. So as soon as we signed papers for the property, I went over there, got my saw, and I sawed it off, and I did not treat it with anything. This is 20 years later. I am still fighting the the things that have come up from the shoots, that have come up from the roots of that massive plant, because I did not kill the root system. If I had painted the edge of that stump after I cut it off with an herbicide, I probably would have been able to kill the root system. So I decided after a few years of trying to do it without herbicide that I'm not going to live long enough. I will lose that battle. And what we do is we don't spray anything, but particularly for our woodies, we cut and paint. And by we, I mean me. Cindy won't touch the stuff either. And if I get it out, she leaves. But you know, for the big multiflora roses or autumn alum and stuff, it's just so much easier to cut it. Nandina would be great. You cut it at the base and paint it with a little paintbrush. You're not using very much material at all. For years, I have planned to take soil samples right around a stump that I have painted to see how much material is actually getting into that. I just haven't done that. I should really do that. But I know that it's often not enough to even kill the plant that you're trying to kill, and you have to do it again. But if you don't kill the root system, it comes back. Now for things like Japanese honeysuckle that grows along the ground, or we have a terrible problem with Japanese stilt grass. We just haven't dealt with it. I mean, that would require blanketing the entire property with herbicides, and we haven't done that. We do hand pulling. It'll go on forever. But we have gotten rid of the big woodies, and that's allowed us to put a lot of very productive plants back. So anything that kills the root system, and some people, you know, put on vinegar and or put black plastic over it. Depends on the size of the area that you're dealing with. You can exhaust any root system by continually cutting back, and by continuing, I mean every 2 weeks. Every time it pokes some green material up, you cut it off again. So for small number of plants, you can do that. But if you're talking about any kind of an area, that takes a lot of dedication. But it would avoid the use of herbicides.
Okay, one more question we're going to get to. Somebody has planted a lot of native trees on their small lot, and now they have all shade and can't grow any of the cool flowering plants that we talk about for pollinators. She's thinking that might have been a mistake and wondering if she should take some out, or what she should plant instead.
Well, that somebody is us. I mean, we've got 10 acres, and we have just about eliminated our sun by planting so much. You just don't realize how big these plants are going to grow. So yes, that's what I'm doing. I call it editing. I'm seeing where I don't want to lose sunlight. I do want flowering plants, and I'm taking out some of the things that we planted. We heat with wood, and all the wood that we use for winter heating comes from plants that have grown on our property since we moved in. So I guess that's what people used to do in the old days, but it is perfectly all right to maintain some sun, but realize a small property can't do everything. If you think about your property as part of a matrix in your entire neighborhood, and if you have a relationship with your neighbors, maybe you guys can get together and decide who's going to do the pollinators, which require a lot of sun, who's going to do the oaks, who's going to target monarchs with milkweeds, because you can't do all of that on a single property. If you already have, you know, a big oak tree, you certainly don't want to cut that down to make sun. Let somebody else do the sun. But it takes usually a bigger area than one property can manage.
Thanks, Doug, so much. This has been fabulous. I hope everybody's inspired to go out, and you saw the note from Dottie. We've still got some native plants left in our native plant sale, so go out and get those, or go visit your local nursery. You know, for more events, certainly visit our website at georgiaaudubon.org, and go get Doug's book, Nature's Best Hope. You can certainly visit Eagle Eye Bookshop in Decatur, and we appreciate them for partnering with us. They've got it there. You can get it. And like I said, if you haven't joined Georgia Audubon, now's the time to do it.
Let me remind everybody, the fall is a great time for planting.
We're in it now. We've got that
transition. Our online plant sale ends tomorrow. So check out our website under the conservation tab, down under plants, you'll see the online plant sale.
All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks for coming. Y'all have a great evening.
Hey, thank you. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you, Doug.
Mm-hmm.